showing a summary of information about CO2 emissions by the 10 largest economies in the world. And I think it's fitting because we are talking about aviation, biofuels, and of course biofuels because of emissions. And I would like to start indicating total emissions, CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalent from the US, 4.9 billion tons, China 9.3 billion, Japan 1.1 billion, India 2.1 billion, so forth. You can see that the CO2 per capita emissions of these 10 largest economies, the largest is Canada, 15.5. Second, US, 14.9. Actually, US used to be 20 in 1990. US is doing a very good job in reducing its per capita emissions. In India, even though India total is 2.1 billion, per capita is the lowest, 1.6, because of the large population, of course, in India. Brazil, which is the country I come, it's 428 million tons. Per capita is also low, too. In China, even though it's the largest emitter, per capita is 6.7 and rising. But look at the other column, the last column on the right, which is CO2 emissions per $1 million. US is low, 238 tons per $1 million. Actually, very similar to Brazil. Brazil is 229. China, 683 tons per $1 million. And India, 795. So even though India has a low per capita emission, the emission per $1 million is high in India. So I'm showing this because I think there's a lot of room for improvement in India. And next slide. What is the context in which this discussion is happening? Well, it's happening under the context of the CORSIA agreement, which is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation under ICAO. Many of you know about it. It's an agreement which has been set and has obtained voluntary adhesion by over 70 countries, including US and China, which have promised to begin implementing its provisions starting this year, 2020. And essentially, this scheme does not take into effect until next year, but it will be voluntary until 2027. And under this agreement, global aviation emissions target is to have a 50% reduction by 2050 relative to 2005, and full neutralization starting 2021. Next slide, please. Aviation accounts for around 2.4% of global CO2 emissions. This is according to the IPCC. However, what is the importance of it? Radioactive forces impacts of aviation emissions are thought to be 2 to 4 times that of direct CO2 emissions. So there is a big impact from emissions coming from aviation. And the per capita emissions from air travel is one of the highest in comparison with other modes of transportation. So even though when we address per capita emissions, we're considering it on a broad basis. In aviation, the per capita emissions are much higher. Okay? And the countries that have agreed to fulfill CORSIA represent about 85% of the international aviation activity today. Next. You can Let's go to the next one, please. Thank you. Globally, around 8.5 million people fly daily, 3 billion occupied seats per year. This is growing. Today, it is twice as much as it was in 1999. And what I wanted to show, in 2018, global commercial operations emitted 918 million tons of CO2. So it's about 1/10 of China's emission and accounts for 2.4% of all CO2 emissions. And how it's the composition, 747 million for passenger transport and 171 million for freight. Next. Under this context, we see biofuels as one element that could help. Actually, in Brazil, we helped in the inception and development of biofuel applications in aviation in early 90s. And I'm glad to report that today, all 100% aviation for agricultural applications in Brazil, spraying applications, are made with ethanol in piston engines. There is a very popular airplane in Brazil called Ipanema, like the song, The Girl from Ipanema. It's called Ipanema, the aircraft produced by Embraer. And you can look at the internet, and there are over 3,000 aircraft flying in Brazil for agricultural spraying. All use ethanol. Why ethanol is so important? Because it's much cheaper than avgas. It doesn't have the deterioration characteristics of avgas. And pilots love it because of the high octane. And some that do a little bit of acrobatics enjoy it very much. But when we talk about jet fuel, it's another story. And in jet fuel, there are many alternatives. And the question presented by Professor Tanaka is very intriguing. And I want to comment it a little bit. Because he mentioned what could be alternatives, to the conventional jet fuel. Hydrogen, photovoltaic. Well, I think for large aircraft that use jet fuel, essentially you would be looking for high energy density fuels because of long haul. And certainly hydrogen would be fulfilling that requirement of high density. However, hydrogen would have to be stored in high pressure tanks. And at 30,000 feet, even higher. And that could be an issue for safety, for liability of the aircraft. So I question whether that is the route. Maybe it's not the route. Photovoltaic, you would have to have a storage of the energy, which is the purpose of the hydrogen. And then you run into the problem of the battery, because the batteries, unfortunately, still have a low energy density. So I think we end up falling in the solution of a liquid fuel. Hydrotreated fuels, vegetable oils seem to be a very good alternative. And then you have a whole variety of oils that can be used, tallow, soybean oil, palm oil. But then it becomes a question of sourcing of the feedstock, which is something that another friend here has called attention. In some regions, sourcing may be available. I can tell you, in Brazil, for instance, only 40% of soybean is being crushed today. Why? Because 60% of the soy is exported in grain. But it's crushed someplace else. It's crushed mostly in China for food, basically. When I think about vegetable oils, I think the discussion between fuel and food becomes more present. Which is a discussion which I don't see much in the same degree when I think about ethanol. Because ethanol, depending on the feedstock, can be produced with a much broader based production. So synthesis of ethanol for production of jet fuel, biojet fuel, seems to me to be more of the route that we could be following. However, we end up needing a common ground for comparison. And that is what is lacking in the world, a common ground for comparison of carbon intensity and sustainability, which is something which another friend of ours has raised. How sustainable is sustainability? That's why I think key in resolving not only aviation fuels for the future, but essentially energy in transport in general. And this regards to land, sea. We have in sea MARPOL, IMO new regulations, So land, sea, and air. Depends on regulations where you set standards which are very clear, transparent, to measure carbon intensity, to measure efficiency, in grounds which are understandable and certifiable according to international rules. That is what we tried very intensively to do in Brazil with RenovaBio. And I invite you to learn more about RenovaBio. Because RenovaBio, we designed, Mike, having the low carbon fuels standard in California in our mind. But we went beyond. We created a system that stimulates innovation and efficiency on top of that. So think about it. I think we need more RenovaBios around the world, and eventually you may consider looking into that in other places, including India. Thank you very much.